Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Castle of the Winds, a roguelike RPG developed by Rick Sada for the Microsoft Windows platform back in 1989, with an eventual full-scale release distributed by Epic Mega Games for the Windows 3.1 computer platform back in 1993. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall. Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, Hammond Egger, Mike Mitchell, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start talking about Castle of the Winds, I figured it would be a good idea to let everybody know why I chose Castle of the Winds for today's episode. And the simple fact is, I didn't. I didn't choose this game because it is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one is sponsored by Chris Snowden. Chris did record a message about Castle of the Winds and why that game means something to him. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Tony, for reviewing this game that brings back so many positive and entertaining memories for me. I first came across this game whilst I worked for an IT company in the UK in the early 90s. One of my colleagues passed me a disc saying, "Try this, you'll like it." What was on the disc was a shareware version of Castle of the Winds. With it being on floppy, it ran really well on our Windows 3.1 machines. I was kept very entertained for nearly 2 years of lunch breaks. I did eventually buy the full game and sequel, a simple dungeon crawler that pulled me in. I hope you enjoyed some of the experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. Now, interestingly, even though I didn't pick Castle of the Winds for today's episode, I do have some experience with Castle of the Winds. The thing is, though, back when it originally came out, and it was fairly popular, at least for people who played games on Windows 3.1, this acted as a sort of gateway into other experiences. We're going to talk all about that in a little bit. But back when this originally came out, I did not know about it. I did not play Castle of the Winds back when it originally came out on the Windows 3.1 computer platform. No, my first exposure to Castle of the Winds was probably a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half ago at this point. And where I saw it was actually in a shareware compilation CD called Wacky Windows Stuff. I have talked before about how much I love shareware, how much I thought that shareware was the coolest thing because you could often get these bite-sized demos or pieces of games, play them for a little bit. If you like it, you pay money, you get the full thing. I used to love buying little $5 shareware discs. I used to love buying the shareware compilation CDs that were prevalent in the earlier 90s. And I also used to love going to computer shows, which I'm not sure, do they still have like real computer shows? I know they have big conventions, like retro gaming conventions and all that kind of stuff. But do they have the same kind of computer shows that used to exist back in the 90s? The ones where you go into these convention halls and all it is wall-to-wall tables of different people trying to sell stuff, whether they're trying to sell computer hardware or computers themselves or monitors or software. Sometimes they would try to sell the discs out of the boxes and they would sell them at a discount because you don't have the box. You don't have to spend as much money. Now, I have no idea. I'm sure some of those were bootlegs back when I was younger and I just was never the wiser. But I used to love going to computer shows and walking around and seeing all the different cool stuff that was out there. And oftentimes computer shows were a little bit less expensive than going to a major retail store to buy your stuff like Computer City or CompUSA or any of those kind of stores. So I loved going to computer stores I did, but actually I meant I loved going to computer shows. So one day, as I was younger, I went to this computer show and my father, my brother and I, we were there, we were walking around, we were looking at all sorts of stuff. And then I heard somebody on a microphone and they were talking about this brand new shareware compilation called Wacky Windows Stuff. And that's exactly how the guy sounded. That is exactly what he sounded like when he was on this microphone. And I started thinking to myself, well, what's Wacky Windows Stuff? That sounds intriguing. So I walked over and there was actually a crowd around this guy. He was wearing one of those headset microphones and he was talking to the crowd and he was like, do you like cool software? I'm like, yes, I do. Do you like amazing games? Yeah, well, boy, is this guy seeing into my mind right now? Yes, of course I like amazing games. And then he's like, well, then you will love Wacky Windows Stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, you just sold me. I am a sucker for this. Give me Wacky Windows Stuff. I want Wacky Windows Stuff. Where do I give you my money? Here, take my money. Give me Wacky Windows Stuff. So I did give him my money and he gave me Wacky Windows Stuff. And I was so excited. I looked at the disc, I looked at the jewel case and it talked about like 100 different software applications and utilities and games. There were so many games on the jewel case. If I remember correctly, I believe the games were actually printed on the jewel case. But even if it wasn't, there were so many games that he promised. There was like a flyer there that talked about all the stuff that was on the disc. I was so excited and I couldn't wait to get home and put Wacky Windows Stuff into my multimedia PC and enjoy all of the stuff that was included on that disc. So we got home from the computer show. I went right to my computer. This is the computer I always talk about, the Tandy 486 SX 25 megahertz with 4 megabytes of RAM, the 80 megabyte hard drive. That was my jam. I mean, that was my machine. So I sat down, I opened up my single speed CD-ROM drive, which was not mechanical. I mean, it was mechanical, but it wasn't automatic mechanical. I had to press the little tray in and then it would pop out and I put the disc in and I closed it up. And I went to the file explorer. And I double-clicked on the disc, and it didn't work. I was devastated. I was absolutely devastated. I couldn't experience Wacky Windows Stuff because the darn disc was corrupted, or there was some issue with how he made the disc or how the disc was made, and I never got to experience Wacky Windows Stuff when I was younger. I was heartbroken. I felt like there were so many things I could have experienced and now I couldn't. I was absolutely, I was upset. I'm being totally honest. I was a kid at the time, but I was so disappointed that I couldn't experience Wacky Windows Stuff. That is a memory that has stuck with me literally since, I don't know, 92-ish, somewhere around there. I was maybe 11 years old at the time. That memory stuck with me. And I always thought to myself, I've got to eventually experience Wacky Windows Stuff. I don't care that it's now 30 plus years later. This was unfinished business. So around a year and a half, 2 years ago, somewhere around there, I was thinking to myself, and this was another period of time when I was thinking about shareware and reminiscing. I thought, well, wait a second. I wonder if Wacky Windows Stuff is available on the Internet Archive, because the Internet Archive has tons of stuff, even some obscure stuff. So I went out there, I did a search for Wacky Windows Stuff, and it was there. Well, let me tell you, I have never downloaded an ISO so quick in my life. I downloaded that thing, I mounted the drive, I got it all set up on Windows 3.1, and I was finally able to experience Wacky Windows Stuff. Finally, a journey I completed or started over 30 years ago was now complete, and I could fully experience all of the goodness that I had missed from back when I was younger. As I was doing that, I thought to myself, this might make for an interesting Patreon episode. So I did, in fact, make an entire Patreon episode focused on wacky Windows stuff. And the core focus of that episode was going through each of the experiences, or at least a good chunk of the experiences on the disk, and determining whether they were wacky, or I think it was wacky or tacky or something like that, where it's like, hey, if it was good, it was wacky. If it wasn't, then it was tacky. I think that was the rating scheme I used. I could be wrong. Somebody will probably let me know if I messed that up. But if something was really good, I would declare it was wacky. And the goal was to determine whether wacky Windows stuff truly was wacky enough to have deserved a purchase back when I bought it back when I was younger. So that's a long backstory. But the purpose behind that story is when I was playing through wacky Windows stuff for the Patreon episode, I came upon a game that I did play called Castle of the Winds. Now, as we're going to talk about, Castle of the Winds actually came in two parts. The first part was a sort of shareware kind of release, and then the second part was a full retail release. Eventually, they would both go into the retail stores and be released in boxes and all that kind of cool stuff, which we will talk about. But Castle of the Winds, the first part, was released as shareware. So I played the game, and I had never really heard about it before I played it as I was going through wacky Windows stuff. But as I was sitting down to play it, I thought to myself, this is strangely engaging, because as we're going to talk about, there is no audio. The graphics in the game are pretty much based on Windows 3.1 icons and high-level Windows. Like, if you play this game, you will know you are playing a Windows 3.1 game. And you will tell that this was made by a single person. And you will tell that the game itself doesn't look like it'd be something that is all that great, or at least it looks like a product of its time. But then you start playing it, and it grips you. It grabs your attention, and it's just fun. I found myself, so when I did the wacky Windows stuff episode, a lot of the shareware games I was playing, I would play for as much time as it took to really get a feel for the overall experience. I didn't necessarily complete all of the shareware games, but I did play them enough to be able to pass judgment as far as whether I thought they were wacky or tacky or whatever my rating was. Castle of the Winds, when I played that, I played through to completion. I played the entire first part that was available. It took me several hours to play that first part back when I played it for the Patreon episode. And I gotta say, I had an amazing time with it. This was the kind of game that grabs you, and you don't even know you're spending that much time playing it. There is an engaging, addicting gameplay loop here that I did not expect when I looked at the game. Like I said, at face value, it looks like a very old Windows 3.1 program. But when you play it, it just works. Everything worked about it. It was a rudimentary experience, but it was also way deeper than it had any right being. So I beat part 1, the shareware edition. I beat part 1, and I was curious about what part 2 would be like, but I never sat down to actually play it. Which is why this episode provided a perfect opportunity to do so. Now I could play the entire game, parts 1 and 2, and tell you about my experience. And it also meant that I got to re-experience Windows 3.1, which is one of my favorite operating environments in computer history. Anyway, as I sat down to begin playing Castle of the Winds, I was curious. Would I feel the same way about Castle of the Winds today as I did when I played the shareware version a couple years ago? And would the full version of the game be worth my time? Or would this be an example of a game that was great in a bite-sized shareware package, but doesn't maintain the same level of quality throughout the entire experience? That is just one of the questions we're going to attempt to answer as we begin diving deep into Castle of the Winds. Castle of the Winds is a roguelike RPG developed by Rick Sada for the Microsoft Windows platform back in 1989, with an eventual full-scale release distributed by Epic Mega Games for the Windows 3.1 computer platform back in 1993. Before we can talk about Castle of the Winds, we need to talk about its creator, Rick Sada, a talented software engineer who, like many developers and game designers back in the 80s, were inspired by the pioneering works that early computer game creators made back in the 1970s. In Rick Sada's case, the game that captured his attention and showed him that computers could do more than process spreadsheets or run monolithic machines was none other than the ancestor of nearly every adventure game in history. Will Crowther's Colossal Cave Adventure. Much like the legendary Roberta Williams before him, Sada became enamored with Colossal Cave Adventure, which he would often play in his father's research lab when he was younger. While Sada didn't have a personal computer at home, he did have access to the computers his father used for work, and luckily for Sada, one of them had Colossal Cave Adventure installed, just waiting to be explored. While it's unclear exactly how Colossal Cave Adventure came to be installed on a computer whose purpose was ostensibly to do actual work, Sada didn't care. He was able to begin exploring the world of interactive computer entertainment, one line of text parser input at a time. We've talked about Colossal Cave Adventure before, and about the fact that Will Crowther based the game on his own exploration of various cave systems he would explore whenever he went spelunking. While attempting to figure out a way to connect more closely with his daughters following a divorce from his wife, Crowther came up with the idea behind the game, which would become an interactive adventure where individuals could explore a massive series of caves, complete with traps to avoid, puzzles to solve, and treasures to earn. Because this was in an era of computing before on-screen graphics were even a thing, all of Colossal Cave Adventure's gameplay would be text-driven, with text-based narration being presented to players that described the scenes and locations they were navigating, while players themselves would tell the computer exactly what they wanted to do by entering commands into a text parser, crossing their fingers really hard that the computer would understand what they were attempting to accomplish. While Colossal Cave Adventure might be looked at as a primitive example of an adventure game when compared to the more complex and graphically rich experiences that would follow, Sada was absolutely blown away by the game. Never before had he experienced an interactive adventure where literally anything appeared possible, and as was the case with many aspiring computer programmers after experiencing their first landmark game, Sada's imagination began to run wild, and it didn't take long before he began to consider that he too might be able to create his own computer game. The only issue was, Sada didn't have any programming or technical computer knowledge to speak of. Sure, he knew how to use a computer, and he certainly knew how to play games like Colossal Cave Adventure. But there's a pretty big gap between knowing how to use a computer and making your own game. If Sada was going to make his own potentially popular gaming experience, he was going to need a little bit of education. So, Sada decided he was going to teach himself how to program on a computer, beginning with learning the basics of, BASIC, an early programming language designed to be simple to use and provide users with a natural language environment for creating any sort of program they might want to make. Rather than needing to learn the intricacies of assembly language, where you had to worry about direct memory access and the state of CPU registers, BASIC programs were easily readable and creatable by human beings. As a very simple example, if you wanted to display the word hello on a computer screen, all you had to do in BASIC was write the line 10, or whatever number you wanted to use to designate the program's line number, followed by the text print hello. Accomplishing that same task in assembly language would have been much more complex and not nearly as understandable. And typically, unless you were already very tech-savvy, teaching yourself assembly language was not an easy task. Sada recognized that he was intelligent, but also didn't want to spend years before he had something tangible to show for his efforts. So he decided to focus on teaching himself BASIC, and in relatively short order, he was proficient enough to actually create his own game, a simple text adventure in the same vein as Colossal Cave Adventure that he dubbed Iron Mountain. Now, Iron Mountain was not exactly a popular title. Wait, I take that back. Other than two of Sada's friends who he showed the game to, Iron Mountain wasn't just unpopular, it was an entirely unknown title. The game ran on the singular machine he programmed it on in his father's lab, and only 3 people in the world ever had a chance to play it. But, despite the limited reach of Sada's first game, he was bitten by the computer programming bug, and his life would legitimately never be the same. Shortly after his early programming efforts, Sada would begin attending Princeton University with the hopes of earning a formal education that could help him continue to develop his computer programming skills, beyond what he was able to teach himself. While at university, however, Sada would become distracted, this time by another incredibly influential computer game, the classic title Rogue. While Colossal Cave Adventure would give birth to the entire adventure game genre, Rogue would give birth to two different gaming genres, both of whose popularity is still sky high even today. While we're not going to talk about Rogue in any detail at the moment, the fact is that Rogue is one of the most influential games ever created. And today, when you hear people talk about roguelike and roguelite experiences, they're describing two gaming subgenres that are directly named after and inspired by the unique blend of procedurally generated dungeons, randomized enemy encounters and equipment, and permadeath mechanics that Michael Toy and Glenn Wichman built into their original Rogue release back in 1980. Sada didn't play Rogue when it was originally released in 1980, but he did play Rogue in 1983, as did the rest of Princeton University. In fact, so many people were playing Rogue at the university that the computer mainframes that were supposed to be used for compiling code couldn't function, because they were, instead, running Rogue. To say Rogue was popular would be an understatement, and Sada became even more enamored with Rogue than he had been with Colossal Cave Adventure. Now, don't get me wrong, Sada loved Colossal Cave Adventure. It's just that the game, as with any other adventure title of the time, had a defined beginning, middle, and end. And after you beat one of those adventure games, the overall replayability of the title would by definition dwindle. Sure, you could technically replay any game you want, but it's not like your next playthrough of an adventure game, at least in this era of history, would change from your prior playthrough, because adventures were, for the most part, static. Rogue, however, was dynamic. Every time you played Rogue, something different could technically happen, and there was no guarantee that one playthrough would resemble the next. This concept was exciting to Sada, though at the time, he didn't really have any aspirations to pursue the creation of his own roguelike experience. He just knew that he really liked the game, but creating another computer game was, at this point, not something Sada was focused on. No, rather than focus on creating a new game, Sada was dedicated to completing his studies, and he did end up successfully graduating from Princeton in 1985. Sada, however, wasn't content, and believed he could learn even more if he continued to pursue higher education, which is what prompted him to apply to a number of different prestigious universities to hopefully earn a graduate degree and become even more proficient in programming computers. Sada was hopeful that he would be accepted to one of his targeted universities, but he was also realistic in recognizing that he probably needed some sort of backup plan, just in case he wasn't accepted into a graduate program, and interestingly, he knew just the thing to do. A number of his friends had applied for jobs with a rapidly developing Seattle-based company named Microsoft, and Sada figured that if the company was good enough for his friends, it was probably good enough for him too. So, while he awaited responses on his graduate school applications, Sada applied to Microsoft, hoping to at least get an interview, but also recognizing that if he got accepted into grad school, future work pursuits would have to wait. Eventually, Sada did receive responses from all of the universities he applied to, and not a single one accepted him into their graduate program. Luckily, however, Sada would be much more successful with his backup plan, as shortly after interviewing with Microsoft, he was offered a job, an offer he quickly accepted given his lack of acceptance into one of his desired graduate programs. After joining Microsoft, Sada was assigned to work on the DOS version of Microsoft Word, an assignment that Sada believed was meaningful, but perhaps not quite as forward-leaning as he had hoped. Microsoft Word was, and still is, Microsoft's premium word processing application, and today is bundled as part of the broader Microsoft Office suite of tools and applications. Back when Sada joined Microsoft in 1986, however, there was no Microsoft Office. There were simply individual applications like Word, Excel, and Access, and any Microsoft programmers assigned to work on those applications were typically split into two distinct teams. One team would focus on the DOS versions of those titles to help support what many considered to be the quote-unquote standard operating system for many computers of the time, while another team would be focused on the Windows versions of those titles, with design features and capabilities that were comparatively much more advanced than their DOS counterparts. Sada was happy to have a job, but he wasn't particularly thrilled with working on the DOS version of Word. Sada believed that Microsoft Windows was the future, and he figured that he would need to somehow learn how to program for Windows if he hoped to have a successful career with the company, as DOS, while the standard, was likely going to be replaced someday by the more graphical and user-friendly Windows interface. So, Sada resolved to begin programming for Windows and was hopeful that learning yet another new skill would serve him well in his future career pursuits. There was only one issue. There weren't any openings on the Windows-based teams at the time, and even further, bringing someone without any Windows programming experience onto those teams could potentially derail those teams' efforts, as can sometimes happen when an inexperienced individual joins a high-performing team. Sada didn't want to be a drag on any potential future team, but he did want to transition out of DOS and into the world of Windows programming. So he did the only thing he could do, and something that harkened back to the earliest days of his computer pursuits. He began to teach himself. Sada figured out that learning how to program for Windows by creating some productivity software might not be the most meaningful or fun use of his time. Instead, Sada considered that he might create a game in order to really learn what it would take to bring a Windows programming experience to life. Only here, he had some decisions to make. Like we talked about, Sada's earliest game, Iron Mountain, had been influenced by Colossal Cave Adventure, and though he enjoyed adventure games, he recognized the inherent limitations of the genre, most prominently the lack of replayability. Sada recalled, however, how much fun he had had playing Rogue, as well as other similar titles, while he was attending Princeton, and he began to consider that he might be able to make his own rogue-like experience, a sort of dungeon crawler combined with role-playing game mechanics, influenced by games like Rogue, but also combining his love of other gaming experiences that he had enjoyed, like the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons. If Sada could figure out how to make a graphically oriented roguelike experience, then he could accomplish several personal goals with a single effort. Not only could he learn how to program for Windows in general, but he could also learn how to use Windows' underlying graphical subsystems, making it so that he could potentially gain a broad understanding of the entire Windows operating environment, just by creating this brand new game in his spare time. Over the next couple years, Sada would devote as much time as possible to creating his game, with a mix of inspirations providing source material for the experience, like the previously mentioned Rogue computer game, the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons, and, perhaps most intriguingly, Norse mythology. In a prior interview, Sada explains that he had always had an interest in mythology, and as he was setting out to create this new game, he figured that Norse mythology might provide a good backdrop for the narrative, setting, and creatures included in the game, primarily because Norse mythology wasn't something that was commonly referenced in popular culture. From Sada's perspective, Greek and Roman mythology was widely known. Norse mythology, though? Not so much, and he thought that his game could potentially leverage this less popular mythology to great effect, assuming he could actually complete his work on the game. Efforts to create Sada's roguelike title continued slowly but surely, though it was the upcoming release of Windows 3.0 that really intrigued him and made Sada redouble his efforts to finish his game, mostly because Windows 3.0 provided significant graphical enhancements over prior versions of Windows, with the potential of eventually using 256 color graphics, a ridiculous level of quality for the time, and a huge leap over prior versions of Windows that only supported 8 colors. As the Windows 3.0 capability set became finalized, Sada's work on his game accelerated, until finally, he had a mostly working version of the roguelike experience he set out to make several years before. What started as a means of teaching himself Windows programming had evolved into an actual playable game, an experience that Sada would name Castle of the Winds. Sada was excited to be finished developing the initial version of the game, but he also considered that if he wanted to turn this game into something that could potentially be released on the market, there might be additional features to add and bugs to squash. And being a solo developer in an effort, he was perhaps a bit too close to the development of the title to really have an objective opinion on what was working and what wasn't. So, Sada decided to leverage the collective power of Microsoft by releasing Castle of the Winds on the corporate Microsoft network for any interested individuals to begin playing, with the hope that any interested Microsoft staff would provide feedback to help improve the game over time. Certainly a bold move, especially considering this was not an official Microsoft project, and in fact wasn't truly associated with Microsoft in any capacity. In today's world, releasing a personal project on a corporate network would almost certainly be met with some sort of negative reaction, potentially resulting in the employee being fired on the spot. Luckily for SADA, however, the Microsoft of the late 80s was not a stuck-up corporate entity. It was simply a rapidly growing company, full of innovation and talent. The Microsoft of the late 80s welcomed SADA's unsanctioned game to be released on its network, and after it was made available to play, a number of individuals began to try the title, often providing feedback to SADA about how to tweak the game to make it even better. Over time, an actual fan community inside of Microsoft formed around the game, eager to play any new features or additions that SADA might make to the game's content. Using feedback from these unofficial testers, SADA continued to improve the game and add additional features, until finally, by 1989, SADA had a 100% working, fully tested, multi-hour game ready for players outside of Microsoft to experience. There was just one issue. SADA needed to figure out the best way to actually distribute his new game. SADA's first thought was to pursue the shareware model of software distribution, where a game might release its first episode for free, with interested gamers required to pay some sort of fee to access the rest of the game. Shareware was very big in the late 80s and early 90s, so it stands to reason that a shareware distribution model might make a ton of sense. Ultimately, however, SADA decided to pursue a variant of shareware distribution, known as the quote-unquote sequelware distribution model. With sequelware, gamers could get an entire game, often designated as a Part 1, entirely for free. But if they wanted to play the sequel and reach the true ending of the experience, they would need to pay for a retail copy of that sequel. This sounded like a good approach to SADA, so he redesigned Castle of the Winds to consist of 2 parts, the first of which would be released for free, with the second having a full retail release. So, SADA knew how he wanted to distribute the game. He just didn't know how he was actually going to distribute the game, because as a solo developer, he didn't have any sort of publishing connections or ability to get his game featured in stores or magazines. He was going to have to rely on sheer determination and luck to be successful. Luckily for SADA, however, Tim Sweeney, the founder of Epic Mega Games, somehow learned about Castle of the Winds, and he thought there was a ton of potential. So, Sweeney made a proposal. Epic Mega Games would publish and distribute the game for SADA, and in return, Epic Mega Games would get a percentage of money from each copy sold. Well, it didn't take long for SADA to agree to Epic Mega Games' distribution deal, and it turns out that was a very good deal for SADA, as Castle of the Winds would sell over 13,000 copies shortly after its full release on the market in 1993, solely through sequelware registrations, while eventually becoming so popular that it would receive a full big box retail release for both Part 1 and Part 2 of the game's overarching story. In fact, Castle of the Winds would become so popular that even stores that weren't dedicated to computer sales, like Walmart, began carrying the game on their store shelves, providing an opportunity for gamers young and old to experience SADA's game. Castle of the Winds, despite beginning its life as an opportunity for SADA to learn how to program for Windows, and despite the fact that it featured no sound and used simplified graphics that resembled standard Windows-based icons, was an unmitigated success, and in fact would act as a sort of gateway for interested players to begin exploring more complex dungeon crawlers and similar roguelike experiences. Castle of the Winds was a full-fledged game, but it was also a much simpler game than many RPGs and dungeon-delving experiences that players might have tried, but ultimately failed to connect with. Castle of the Winds hit a perfect sweet spot between depth and simplicity, and as such provided a unique opportunity for interested gamers to experience a style of game that, at least in the early 90s, wasn't nearly as pervasive as what we might see in modern times. While Castle of the Winds would never reach what I'd consider blockbuster sales figures, it did perform well enough for SADA to amass a relatively large fan base, and for his part, SADA was very excited to continue getting his game in the hands of potential gamers around the world. In fact, as of 1998, SADA would end up releasing the entire game as freeware, making it so that anyone could play Castle of the Winds for free. As long as you had a 16-bit copy of Windows, because Castle of the Winds was a Windows 3.1 application through and through, and is entirely unplayable on pretty much any version of Windows released in the last 20 years, short of emulation via DOSBox and similar applications. Anyway, While Castle of the Winds was dramatically less robust and full-featured than the majority of games released in 1998, and therefore likely wasn't generating a ton of interest outside of individuals who liked trying older games, I still thought it was awesome that Sada decided to release his work for free, simply because he wanted more people to experience and hopefully enjoy Castle of the Winds. Sada would eventually retire from Microsoft in the mid-90s, though he would return to video game development at various points over the years, most often to assist prior acquaintances in developing and releasing their own computer and video games. While Sada may have never become a household name, he certainly was and is a talented game designer, and nowhere is that more evident than in the labor of love that was Castle of the Winds. Like I mentioned, I do have some experience playing through the first part of Castle of the Winds, and I always intended to eventually play part 2 of the title. My question, as I sat down to begin experiencing the full version of Castle of the Winds, was whether the whole experience would be worth my time to play today, or if there simply wasn't enough here to warrant a full playthrough. That's just one of the questions we're going to attempt to answer as we begin diving even deeper into Castle of the Winds. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Castle of the Winds today versus when it was released almost 35 years ago. Castle of the Winds is, at its core, a tops-down two-dimensional RPG with roguelike elements, though from my perspective, Castle of the Winds is much more focused on the RPG side of the equation over the roguelike portion of the experience. While it is true there are roguelike elements baked into the equation, Castle of the Winds is almost more of a Diablo-esque prototype in many ways, and is something that, given the era of gaming that it was created in, is certainly one of the more unique experiences that I've played from the late 80s and early 90s. As with most RPG-styled games, you begin by creating a character, assigning some starting attribute points across traditional statistics like strength, intelligence, dexterity, and constitution, naming your character, and picking a gender, after which you're dropped into your starting town for the game to effectively begin. The first thing you're going to notice upon starting the game is that the graphics and overall user interface for the game are very decidedly Windows 3.1, and if you've never had the joy of experiencing a true Windows 3.1 program from around 35-ish years ago, expect to be a little put off by the visuals present in the game. Unlike many Windows 3.1 titles that attempted to hide the fact that they are in fact a Windows program, Castle of the Winds wears its operating environment influences on its sleeve, with a Windows-based interface consisting of multiple windows, menus, and pop-ups that, if it weren't for the content of those windows, could easily be mistaken for a productivity application. For some of you, this will almost certainly give a similar kind of vibe as titles from the Mac Venture series of adventure games, like Shadowgate and Deja Vu, where the original releases on the Apple Macintosh were designed to look like Macintosh software, complete with traditional desktop windows, fonts, and menus, despite being full-featured games that utilized those traditional desktop features. Castle of the Winds is effectively the same exact kind of thing, albeit for the Windows 3.1 operating environment, and as such, is something that might take some getting used to if you're used to playing games that aren't so closely dependent on the operating environment installed on your personal computer. Anyway, once you get acclimated to the fact that Castle of the Winds features game-centric features in a Windows 3.1 package, you can begin exploring and hopefully enjoying the game in front of you. And you might assume that because Castle of the Winds was originally created in the late 80s, the game would be a pretty simple and less engaging experience than most games that would end up following it. And yes, Castle of the Winds, when compared to the more complex dungeon crawlers and RPGs that would emerge in the mid to late 90s, is certainly a less complex experience. But that doesn't mean that the game is without merit, and in fact, I would argue that Castle of the Winds is one of the more accessible introductions into the RPG and roguelike gaming genres, and despite the relative simplicity of the title when compared to future efforts, there is a lot going on here that we need to talk about, and we're going to go through pretty much every aspect of the game as we continue our discussion. Before we do that though, I should mention that, like we talked about earlier, Castle of the Winds was originally released as a two-part adventure, the first of which was available via shareware, while the second was available as a more direct retail release. For this episode of the podcast, I ended up playing through the entire 2-part adventure, and because of how the games were created, I was able to import my character from the first part of the game into the second part of the game, a degree of continuity that I truly appreciated, and one that not many games of the time supported. Sure, there were other games that let you carry your progress forward from one title to another, but this was not the norm, and oftentimes when you'd sit down to begin playing a sequel to an RPG or other type of game, you'd have to start with a brand new character. Not so in Castle of the Winds, and I truly appreciated the fact that my adventurer could experience the entire 2-part experience from beginning to end. Putting aside that cool design touch, let's talk about what it feels like to actually play Castle of the Winds. And to do that, it probably makes sense to talk through the very early parts of your adventure, because after around an hour or so of playing the game, you'll probably have a pretty good feel for what the rest of the game has in store for you. So, let's say you just created your adventurer and are now ready to begin exploring the world. You'll start out in a small hamlet, complete with several buildings with signs in front of them, which you can almost guarantee are going to be useful in some capacity. If you can figure out how to navigate towards them, that is. And navigation in Castle of the Winds is something we should talk about, because it is a very old school method of traversing an in-game world, and one that will likely take some getting used to for the uninitiated. Like I mentioned before, the game is presented as a tops-down perspective, and using a combination of your mouse and keyboard, you can move in any of 8 directions within that world, those being up, down, left, right, and diagonally, and there are specific keyboard keys that correspond to those specific directions. The easiest approach, assuming you're using a full keyboard, is to simply use the number pad, where up is represented by the number 8, down by the number 2, left by 4, right by 6, and your 4 diagonal directions being represented by 7, 9, 1, and 3 respectively. A control scheme that makes complete logical sense and will likely become second nature after you spend some time playing the game. That being said, there are other control schemes available as well, which become very useful if you're using a keyboard without a dedicated number pad, like say if you're playing on a laptop. If you don't have a number pad, then the primary way of navigating the game world will be via a combination of your arrow keys coupled with several keyboard hotkeys that serve to allow for diagonal movement, like using the N key to move diagonally down and right, or the Y key to move diagonally up and left. You might be wondering why you'd need to use a different key for diagonal movement, because you might assume that pressing up and left on your arrow keys, just as an example, would move you diagonally up and left. Only here, you would be mistaken, because the game only accepts a single key press at a time, other than combo key presses that provide other shortcuts for things like casting spells. This, admittedly, will take some getting used to, though even playing the game without a dedicated number pad, you will get used to navigating the game world using your keyboard. Less recommended is navigating the game world with your mouse, because I firmly believe that the mouse doesn't give you nearly the level of control over your movement to make it the preferred way to play the game. Using the mouse, you can drag your character in any direction, which you might think would be simpler than using the somewhat esoteric keyboard controls. Only here, you would be wrong, as the mouse movement can become cumbersome at best and downright dangerous at worst, especially when you're trying to traverse the individual dungeons that you'll need to progress through to eventually beat the game. The mouse isn't nearly precise enough to allow you to adequately tackle the dungeons in front of you, so from my perspective, keyboard controls are the way to go, at least as it relates to navigating around the game world. And speaking of navigation, the game itself consists of tile-based movement, where every time you move in a certain direction, you're moving your character from one discrete tile to the next, making this a sort of tops-down, grid-based RPG kind of experience, which once again, might take some getting used to if you're not familiar with this older school style of gameplay. Luckily, navigating the game world is relatively simple, at least at first glance, and once you get familiar enough with the core controls to be able to adequately maneuver your character around the game world, you can begin playing Castle of the Winds in earnest. Returning to our example playthrough, we begin the game in a town with several buildings around us, and a natural next step might be to begin exploring those buildings, which you can accomplish by walking into the buildings themselves. I had mentioned before that each building does have a sign outside of it, which you can examine using either the Examine button on the user interface, right-clicking your mouse, or by pressing X on your keyboard and maneuvering a crosshair cursor over the item you want to examine. While the Examine descriptions included in the game are never all that complex, you will find some of them very useful, like, say, the status of a monster you might be fighting, whose overall battle prowess will move through several discrete stages, like uninjured, slightly injured, and critically injured, just to name a few. We're not ready to talk about combat just yet, but suffice it to say, the examine function will be useful when you're dealing with some of the more challenging enemies you'll face during your playthrough. Anyway, let's start exploring the town, and we're going to start with the weaponsmith. Each town in the game does have a weaponsmith, and here is where you will first see the different weapons available to you as you begin to play the game. There are a bunch of different weapons available, ranging from daggers, to clubs, to one-handed swords, to two-handed swords, to bastard swords. All sorts of weaponry are included in the game. Now the thing is, looking at each of these weapons, you will never know what weapon is better than the other because there are no stats screens to let you know what weapon is more damaging than another weapon. To do that, you have to access the game's help system, and I should mention that the help system included in Castle of the Winds is essential to understanding what is going on with the game. For its part, the help system does have help topics for pretty much everything in the game, from the story to the individual weapons and their overall weapon rating, to the armor that's available to you along with their armor class, as well as any spells that you might find during your adventure. Understanding which weapons are better than others can only come by studying the help system, which is not a big deal, but is something that warrants mentioning because as you're playing the game, you will have no way of knowing that a flail might not be as good as a bastard sword, just as an example. Anyway, you explore the weaponsmith, there are weapons there that you could potentially purchase, and early in the game you might even notice some weapons that are classified as enchanted. There are magical weapons and armor included in the game, though it never gets to the point of a true Diablo-esque kind of experience with multiple tier levels of different enchanted magic and all that kind of stuff. No, in Castle of the Winds, it stays relatively simple. You can either have a standard weapon or an enchanted weapon, and those enchanted weapons might have several different modifiers on them, like increasing your ability to hit opponents, increasing your overall damage, or even potentially giving you some sort of passive buff, like the ability to be resistant to fire. Those kind of effects also apply to armor. And as you explore the game, and even as you explore the game's shops, you will sometimes see these enchanted variants of standard weapons and armor. Generally speaking, the enchanted versions of weapons and armor are better than the non-enchanted versions, though there are several different modifiers to the modifiers that might make you want to focus on one weapon over another. As an example, if you see two enchanted swords sitting next to each other, one might say increases character's damage or increases your overall damage. The other one might say strongly increases your damage, which means that is better than the one that doesn't have the strongly modifier applied to it. This is a relatively simple system, but it still works really well within the context of this fairly rudimentary Diablo-esque kind of experience. Anyway, assuming you buy a weapon, you will then be exposed to the game's paper doll screen, which is very traditional in terms of RPG games. And when you think about the fact that paper dolls in games were not pervasive at this point in history, this is actually a very forward-leaning introduction and inclusion in the game. The thing is that while you do have a paper doll, so to speak, representing your character, that doll never really changes regardless of the equipment that you might equip. You do have the very traditional kinds of armor slots and weapon slots surrounding that paper doll kind of experience and that view that you see, but it never really changes the overall look of your character. It's just something that applies to the internal game stats. It never really influences your overall appearance. Regardless, I thought it was cool to include. I should also mention, by the way, that other than normal and enhanced items, you may also find cursed items in the game world. You do not want to equip a cursed item because cursed items carry with them some sort of curse. They might set your strength lower. They might make it so that your equipment is heavier. They might do something bad and you do not want that. Luckily, you can remove curses in the game, both from a spell that you can eventually learn, as well as from another area of a town that we'll talk about in a little bit. But regardless, as you might imagine, you want to avoid using cursed items. Like I mentioned, there are a ton of different equipment options available in the game. There's traditional armor types, there's accessories like rings and necklaces, there's a bunch of different weapons, and there's also a bunch of different activatable items, which you can use using your free hand, which is another slot in your inventory. The free hand is effectively a spot where you can put any activatable item, like say a scroll or a potion, and you can use those items by simply selecting the activate menu and picking that item from that menu. It's a very simple system, but once again, a very cool feature to add because there will be occasions where you're in the midst of battle and maybe you do want to use a wand as opposed to using your own magical spells because your mana might be depleted. So there is some strategy here that comes into what you equip in your free hand. And yes, as I've alluded to a couple times, this game does feature a full spell system built into the experience. There are a few different ways that you can learn the spells that are included in the game. You will be able to learn a single spell as you level up, and the cool thing here is that as you reach different levels, you'll be exposed to new tiers of spells, so to speak. Once again, this is nothing that the game includes in terms of descriptive text. It's just when you reach a certain level, you'll notice that the potential spells you can learn will increase. Once you do that, you realize, oh, I've gotten access to a new tier of spells. So you do learn spells as you level up. You can also learn spells from books that you might find in the game world. You can read those books and then those spells become a permanent part of your overall spell book. And you can also use one-time use scrolls to cast certain spells as well. The way that the spell system works here is, like the rest of the game, relatively simple, but there is a pretty good variety of spells available included in the game. There are damaging spells, there are healing spells, there are defensive spells, there's movement spells, and there are some miscellaneous spells thrown in for good measure. There's probably, I don't know the exact count, but there's probably 20-ish spells or so included in the game, maybe a couple more, but it's around that number. So there's definitely enough diversity here to have some fun with. And as you explore the different spells that you have and you use the help system to learn what each of the spells do, you will start to develop an overall strategy for tackling the game's various challenges. The one thing I do want to mention, and this is an important tip, especially as you're going into the second part of the game, the resist spells like resist fire, resist lightning, resist cold, those spells are going to be very important because you will be facing a number of elemental creatures in the second part of the game. Most prominently, dragons. Dragons are tough. I'm going to go off script a little bit. Dragons are tough. And when you first start encountering dragons, you're going to wonder how the heck you can possibly beat them, especially ancient dragons. So there's different tiers of different monsters, and dragons are probably the ones with the most tiers. You might fight a young dragon, and those are relatively simple. But then you might encounter later in the game an ancient dragon. Those are scary, and they often have breath-based attacks. The defensive spells like resist fire, resist lightning, those kind of things, they will be incredibly useful in surviving some of those encounters because dragons can kill you very, very quickly. Anyway, went on a little bit of a tangent with the combat there and some of the defensive abilities. But the fact is that there are a good number of spells in the game, and for the most part, most of those spells are pretty darn useful. Moving back to our town, if we move past the weaponsmith, we will eventually find the armorsmith. Similar kind of deal here, where there will be different kinds of armor that you can equip. They may be enchanted, they may not be, but there's different armors. Each of those armors have different armor classes, which once again you can find in the game's help system. And because of the way the game is designed, and it really is a Windows 3.1 based interface, getting to the help system is really easy. You just click the help menu, and then a help pop-up window comes up, and then you can navigate around that just like you would any other Windows help system. That might be off-putting to people who want that help system integrated into the game itself via some sort of tutorial, but that's not this era of gaming. So that's not what you're going to get. You're going to get an actual help window that you can navigate with text and hyperlinks the same way you would any other Windows productivity software. Beyond the armorsmith, there is also a shrine available in each town. The shrine is available so that you can restore yourself, whether that's from a hit points perspective. There are also certain debuffs that certain enemies might apply that you can go to the shrine and have them removed. You can remove curses from the shrine. The most I ever used the shrine was a little bit later in the game and predominantly in part 2 of the game, where you'll start to encounter different enemies that will debuff you. You might encounter a vampire that every time they hit you will deplete your hit points, your maximum hit points a little bit. So let's say you are walking around and you have 100 hit points as your max. You might encounter a vampire and they will debuff you every time they hit you, such that after that fight, you now only have 90 max hit points. Well, That's not great, especially because some of the gameplay in the second part of the game is pretty darn challenging. You might also face different ghost-like creatures who will deplete your overall maximum mana. There might be other creatures that deplete your stats, like Constitution and Intelligence, which might lower your overall max stats for other stats. So there's a lot of potential debuffs in the game. I will say that the debuffs that you encounter as you play the game, probably my least favorite part of the entire experience. I feel like that just added a level of tedium, especially later in the game, where if you get debuffed, especially considering some of the challenge, you're going to need to remove those debuffs. There are potions that you can find in the game world where you can remove those debuffs without having to return to town. But sometimes you don't have that potion and you do have to return to town to a shrine to get those debuffs removed. So it's great that the shrine exists, but I will say that its ultimate purpose from my perspective is removing those debuffs, and those debuffs existing in the first place kind of sucked because it took the overall pace of gameplay down. I wanted to continue exploring, fighting, and venturing, and when I got those debuffs, sometimes they stacked on each other so much that I had to return to town and interrupt my overall gaming experience. Regardless, it is great that shrines exist. In towns, you also have an individual that can identify different items because by default, most items are not identified, which means if you pick something up and you equip it, you might be equipping a cursed version of that equipment as opposed to a normal or enchanted version. You need to identify items before you can use them. The identification dealer or the identification person in the town can do that for a small fee, or you will eventually find an identify spell that you can then cast whenever you want, which will let you identify items. Definitely a useful spell, but until then, useful individual in town that can identify those items for you. There's also a junk dealer available in towns where items that are either depleted from charges or items that are kind of more monster-centric, meaning they're actually buffing monsters around you, those are considered junk. And nobody would buy a haste monster spell because why the heck would you want to haste a monster or hasten a monster that you're fighting? You wouldn't want them to attack you faster. So most of the buildings and most of the individuals in the towns consider those items to be junk. Luckily, the junk dealer loves junk and will buy them, albeit for a very low price. So it's not like you're going to get a ton of money from those, but it is great that you have that available. So that's the general structure of towns. There are different towns in the game. Each town has a little bit of a different setup. The town that you encounter in the second part of the game is much more expansive than the two towns you encounter in the first part of the game, but there's really not a whole heck of a lot of additional functionality in that bigger town. It's just that there are more weaponsmiths, there's more armor smiths, there's more spell dealers and that kind of stuff. Something to keep in mind, overall, each town will have the same general capabilities available to you. So, we just went through the town, we bought some equipment, now we're ready to truly begin our adventure. Well, that means that it's time to leave the safety of our town and begin exploring the nearby dungeon. So let's talk about dungeon exploration. Every dungeon in the game will have multiple levels that you can explore, and each of those levels are procedurally generated the first time you step into them. When you go down to a certain floor of a dungeon, that map will be auto-generated, but you won't actually see the map until you explore the dungeon itself. There is a map built into the game, and as you uncover different sections of the world, the map will fill itself in, which is incredibly useful. And actually, considering the fact that the levels are procedurally generated, it's probably a good time to talk about the roguelike aspects of the overall game. We've kind of talked a little bit about the RPG element so far, but like we've talked about, Castle of the Winds does have a bit of a roguelike flair as well. Like I mentioned, dungeon maps are auto-generated whenever you enter that particular floor of a dungeon. There's also auto-generated loot, because when things drop from a given monster, you don't know what that's going to be. Now, I will say that it appears as though the loot is auto-generated along with the floor of the dungeon in general, because you can save and load. We'll talk about the save and load system in a couple minutes, but you can save and load, and when you reload a game, if you're fighting a monster and you beat that monster multiple times because you have to reload the game multiple times for whatever reason, the monster will drop the same exact loot. So while auto-generation is there for loot and the overall dungeon floors, it seems like all of that auto-generation happens once, and then that's it. So whatever happens, the first time you set foot in a given dungeon's floor, that whole environment, the enemies, the equipment, all of that stuff is auto-generated at that point. Now, there are respawns that will happen for different monsters, and those will, of course, have different equipment and other things that go along with it. But outside of the respawns, the original time that you step into a dungeon floor, that is when everything is effectively auto-generated. Like most roguelikes, if you do die, and I'm going to tell you, you will die playing Castle of the Winds, you'll lose your character and have to start the entire game over, unless you've saved your game. And from my perspective, this is the biggest deviation from a true roguelike experience, because you can save your game anytime you want. You can reload your game anytime you want, making it so that you can effectively ignore the fact that death by itself means restarting the whole game. If you are trying to play the game as a main character, so to speak, feel free to treat it as more of an RPG than a roguelike experience. Regardless, though, the fact that every single character you play the game with will be a little bit of a different experience with different dungeon layouts, enemy placements, and loot does make the game have a degree of replayability that is way beyond what I expected given the game's age. Moving past the roguelike elements of the game, we're now in our first dungeon, and it's time to explore. You will move around the dungeon using the control keys that I mentioned earlier. And as you're exploring, you might find traps that you need to either disarm or avoid. You might find secret doors in certain walls. And actually, this is a major aspect of the game, because as you start exploring the dungeons, you may find a room, or you may find certain sections of map where it looks like there's nothing else to do. You're literally at a dead end. You don't really have a dead end, it's just that there is a secret door that needs to be found. If you press the S key on your keyboard, that effectively means you're searching the environment, and that will show you secret doors that might be hidden. The thing is, and I am not sure if this is the best way to play the game, because there are so many secret doors that might be hidden. The way I played the game was by walking around every single environment, and basically every time I moved a tile, I would hit the S key, just to make sure I wasn't missing something that was hidden in the overall environment. The game does use a pseudo time-based system, where everything you do in the game takes a certain amount of time. Hitting the S key does increase the amount of time that you're spending in the in-game world. And the more time you spend, the more opportunity there is for monsters to respawn or other things to happen. So I do not know if this was an optimal way of playing the game, because I'm pretty sure that I ended up respawning monsters that didn't need to be respawned because I kept hammering on that S key, just trying to find all of the different secrets that were out there. But regardless, that is how I played the game. You will occasionally need to use the S key to find secret doors, especially if you want to explore everything in a given dungeon floor, which I did want to do. Anyway, as you continue to explore, you will also identify and find different loot lying around, sometimes literally just on the floor. Some of that loot, like I mentioned earlier, could potentially be cursed, so you want to identify any item before you actually equip it. And of course, you will also find a bunch of monsters included in that dungeon, and you will have to fight them. Fighting monsters in Castle of the Winds is really a very simple experience, because all you do to fight monsters is hit the arrow or hit the appropriate direction on your keyboard towards that particular monster. And assuming that you're occupying adjacent squares or tiles in the game world, you will attempt to hit that monster. Now, the monster will also attempt to hit you as your turns go. And there are various types of monsters that might treat things a little bit differently. As an example, I mentioned dragons earlier. Dragons have a breath-based attack that can stretch multiple squares in front of them, so it's not like they need to be next to you to actually do damage. There are other monsters that have very quick attacks. Some of them can even attack you multiple times compared to your single attack to them. Now, depending on your own stats, you may also get multiple attacks from you to them. So there is some balance here. And fighting monsters in the game, there's actually more strategy than it would first appear, because you might think that just standing next to a monster and wailing away in the direction of that monster is the best way to play the game. But in reality, you will take some additional damage doing that, because basically all you're doing at that point is trading blows. There is more strategy. You need to use your spells effectively. There is one spell that I found incredibly useful, which was the slow monster spell, which a little unclear exactly what it does, because there are two different types of speeds in this game. There is movement speed and then general speed. From my perspective, every time I cast slow monster on a monster, that monster did in fact slow their overall attacks towards me. It was effectively like a slow spell in an MMO or other RPG that you might be playing. I found that incredibly useful. It reduced the amount of damage I took dramatically and made me attack those monsters quicker than they could attack me, which was definitely beneficial. It also slows their overall movement, and movement in the game can also be a strategy because each monster has a certain degree of, I don't know what the right word is. I guess they're programmed with different move speeds, and depending on what that move speed is will depend on when they attack you compared to when you attack them. So as an example, if a given monster, and this is purely hypothetical, if a given monster attacks you every 3 turns, let's say, well, if you're standing right next to that monster, you might be able to get 2 attacks in before that third attack where you'll effectively exchange blows. Or you can attack twice and then move 1 square away, which means that the monster's next move can't hit you because you're no longer on an adjacent space. That monster then needs to move to get back next to you, which means they've effectively lost their turn to potentially hit you. So there is strategy here. You do have to learn what each monster does and what their overall movement rates are in order to truly optimize your overall combat kind of experience. That being said, you can technically just stand there and trade blows with monsters. I did that for a good chunk of the game too, and I was able to get through just fine. The later parts of part 2 get pretty darn challenging, and that's where the strategy really does come into play because I can almost guarantee you will die if you don't focus on that. But overall combat is fairly simple, but it is effective at conveying this overall RPG kind of experience. Now, sometimes you will take damage. Actually, a lot of times you'll take damage, whether that's fighting monsters or encountering traps in dungeons. And if you do, luckily, there is a healing system built into the game. You have healing spells available to you, you have healing potions available to you, and you can also rest. You can either rest to recover hit points, or you can also rest to recover any mana that you might have used by casting spells. Resting to recover mana takes a lot of time. And I mentioned that there is an in-game counter, an in-game timer built into the game, where the longer time passes, the more enemies can potentially respawn or trap you or find you and attack you and all that kind of stuff. So resting in a dungeon can sometimes be a little bit of a risky kind of proposition. At sometimes though, or sometimes you just may have to do it because you're out of mana, you're low on hit points, you have no items, you have to get those hit points and mana back. Luckily, like I mentioned, there is a save feature built into the game, so technically you can save scum your way through it. Like if you hit rest and you get attacked by a monster, you can reload your game and try it again, and maybe you won't be attacked by a monster because there is a degree of randomness here. Regardless, I am glad that that resting system is part of the game. And we'll also say, just for awareness, there are a couple of bugs in the game that you might encounter that might make your experience a little bit different. As an example, there was one part of the game, I was very deep in part 2, very close to the end of the game, and I encountered a ghost enemy, which, like I mentioned earlier, can deplete your mana. Well, somehow, some way, there was a hit. He hit me, and my mana went to negative 22,000. Let me tell you, recovering 22,000 mana points when your traditional max mana is probably in the 100 to 150 range. That's what the game is built around. So the game is built around a max mana of maybe 100, 150. Maybe if your int was higher, it might go up to 200. I'm not sure. I didn't play a supremely intelligent spellcasting kind of character. But the fact is, negative 22,000 mana. To recover all of that, it took so much time. I had to go back to town, and in town you can rest whenever and wherever you want without any sort of potential negative repercussion. So I went back to town, I hit the rest button, and then I literally went off. I got myself a cup of coffee, I got a little bite to eat, and I was kind of relaxing and doing whatever because the game's just going to tick away. And it took so long that the in-game counter, so the in-game timer, by default, only goes up to 255 in-game days because the limit of an integer, I'm assuming this is why, because it just makes perfect sense from a programming perspective, the limit of an integer is 256. So as soon as you hit 256, because it's 0 to 255, you basically reset that integer. Well, it reset that integer day counter multiple times. I mean, there's really no reason why actually, now that I think about it, and just not to get on too much of a technical tangent, there's no reason why an integer couldn't be a bigger number. So I guess there had to be something in the programming that used that as like a standard, because there really is no limit. You could have an integer value in programming bigger than 255. So I don't know. I don't know why that happened, but regardless, there was a built-in limit where after 255, it reset my day counter to 0. So after I rested for literally 3, 4, maybe 5 generations, I went back to the game and my in-game timer is now at 8 days played, which, let me tell you, is not. I played way more than that. That's not real time. That's just in-game time. Regardless, it was kind of an interesting bug. There is also another bug where if you get hit in the right way, your constitution can underflow. Your hit points can underflow, and it will make your constitution max out. That did happen to me once, and because I don't like any sort of quote-unquote cheating in games, I immediately had to reload my game. For one moment, I thought, ooh, I've got like 100 extra hit points. Maybe I should just, the game did it. I didn't try to seek it out. The game did it to me. And maybe I can justify it in my head as it was, I got whacked so much in the head and on the body. And eventually I trained myself up and I got really powerful. And then I thought, no, it's cheating. Darn it, it's cheating. And I had to reload. So those were the two bugs that I experienced as I played the game. Overall, though, pretty bug-free experience and a pretty darn good experience. Anyway, a little bit of a tangent, but regardless, moving back to our dungeon exploration, you will make your way through several levels of every dungeon that you explore. Each dungeon has a different number of levels, and eventually you will find an item, a note, or an encounter that will point to your next location. When that happens, that's effectively the end of that specific dungeon. You then leave the dungeon and begin all over again, this time in a more challenging, longer dungeon and a much more well-developed town with better equipment that you could potentially purchase. This, in a nutshell, is the core gameplay loop of Castle of the Winds. You begin in town, you go to a dungeon, and you return to town. And then you repeat that 2 more times until you beat all 3 dungeons included in the 2-part experience. I'm not trying to suggest that that's a bad game design. I'm just saying that that loop makes up the main structure of the game, which is a relatively simple take on the traditional computer RPG, and one that, from my perspective, is a joy to experience. I know that some of you might be wondering how a game that literally used Windows 3.1 styled icons for game graphics could possibly be that good. But I'm sitting here telling you that yes, Castle of the Winds is a remarkable experience in early RPG computer gaming, and is one whose apparent simplicity hides a surprisingly deep amount of content and mechanics. We've already talked through most of those mechanics, which hopefully gives you a sense of why I consider Castle of the Winds deeper than it might first appear. But even beyond the core gameplay loop, there is a lot to like about the game in general, and we're going to start talking about those specific aspects of the game in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Castle of the Winds for the Windows 3.1 computer platform, the back of the box says, Castle of the Winds 1. Get ready for the fight of your life. The goal? Avenge the death of your godparents and reclaim your birthright. The twist? You create your own character determining his or her sex, strength, intelligence, and dexterity. Sounds easy enough, right? Think again. Castle of the Winds is going to take every bit of courage, wit, and quick thinking. Armed with basic weapons, you are let loose in a tiny hamlet. While exploring, you discover bits and pieces about your past. Go on to journey through a mine in the mountains, a tiny village, and finally a giant fortress. There's just one piece of information we have yet to mention. Along the way, you will meet up with over 100 evil monsters, which must be slain to reach your goal. Battle everything from devils to dragons, humans to humanoids, each more dangerous than the last. Do not give up. If you keep your wits, you will discover magic potions, scrolls mapping out different levels, and more to help you along the way. With stunning graphics and one thrilling challenge after another, Castle of the Winds 1 is the game you have been waiting for. And then there is a single screenshot on the back of the box and some bullets that say, Castle of the Winds contains outstanding graphics and sound, challenging fun for the whole family, no graphic violence, full menu with storyline, and easy installation. That is the back of the box for Castle of the Winds 1, but like I mentioned, I did play both Castle of the Winds 1 and 2 for today's episode, so let's go read the back of the box for Castle of the Winds 2, which says, Over 100 evil monsters stand between you and destiny. Your godparents have been murdered, and you are out to seek revenge and reclaim your birthright. To do this, you must defeat Surtur and recover the stolen Helm of Storms from his possession. To begin, create your own character, determining sex, strength, intelligence, and dexterity. Then, collect your weapons and head out for your journey. Keep your eyes open along the way. You will discover magical potions and maps that will bring you great relief, and you will need every bit of armor possible to complete the task. After all, you must struggle through 25 treacherous levels in the Castle of the Winds. Do battle with one repulsive monster after another, each more dangerous than the last. Just when you think it is safe, poof, a deadly trap. Do not give up. Your family name and your happiness is at stake. With fantasy-like role-playing, stunning graphics, and a thrilling soundtrack, Castle of the Winds 2 will keep you on the edge of your seat. And then a couple of screenshots here as well, and then some bullets which say Castle of the Winds contains outstanding graphics and sound, challenging fun for the whole family, no graphic violence, full menu with storyline, easy installation, and VGA graphics. So those were the back of the boxes for Castle of the Winds 1 and 2, and I have got to say, I don't know if they really sell me on the game. The text is written very formally, I guess is the way to put it. It doesn't read well. Well, let me put it this way. Reading it out loud, it doesn't speak well, so to speak. It just doesn't feel like it flows, and I get it. The back of the box is not meant to be recited, it's meant to be read. So I totally get that. But even from that perspective, this feels a little bit too simple. There's really not a whole heck of a lot there. It's also completely lying to you, by the way. Now, in all fairness, I do not have the original copies, the original boxed copies of Castle of the Winds 1 or 2. I do not. All I have are versions I was able to find online. So it's entirely possible that my versions of the game are different than these retail boxed versions. But the boxes talk about a soundtrack, and they talk about stunning graphics and sound. And all I've got to say to that is I don't know what they're talking about because the version of the games that I played have no sound whatsoever. There is literally the only sound in the game is when you make a mistake navigating a menu or you try to navigate to a window when another window's on top of the screen. And all it does is do the normal Windows 3.1 chime sound. And that's it. That's the only sound that I heard in the game. Is it possible my versions of the game were messed up? Yes, it's entirely possible. I cannot confirm that. I can't confirm whether the retail boxed versions had any sound. Nothing I found online suggested that they did, but I will give them the benefit of the doubt, except for the fact that I won't, because this is just a lie. It is a lie compared to what I experienced myself. Regardless, the back of the box is not bad, and I could kind of see what they were going for. It just felt a little more amateur to me, which of course the game did begin its life as a single solo developer effort. So I get it, but this is one of those situations where the back of the boxes don't really speak to me all that well. The game itself is actually way better than what the back of the boxes would suggest. Seeing the boxes, it's kind of like, okay, I mean, sure, it sounds fine-ish. Playing the game is a different matter entirely. So let's talk more specifically about aspects of the game that you do experience when you play it. And we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The bottom line is that the graphics in Castle of the Winds are very primitive. They're tile-based graphics, and they are designed as though they were made in Microsoft Paint. I don't mean this to be disparaging about the overall visuals in the game, because for what it is, I think it actually looks okay. But you're not going to get high-quality HD styled visuals here. You're not even going to get high-quality 8-bit styled visuals. This is a very primitive-looking Windows 3.1 title. When you walk around the world, look in dungeons. If you're walking around in dungeons, the dungeons that you walk around have very, limited backgrounds, and they share the same basic tile set. So the 3 dungeons that you go through, you're not really going to notice any difference between those 3 dungeons in terms of the overall graphics. For the most part, the backgrounds are the same, the tiles are the same. There are a couple of rooms that look a little bit different. There are some rooms that look like throne rooms, which add a little bit of additional graphical flair. But for the most part, the dungeons and the rooms and the floors of the dungeons all look nearly identical, albeit with different geometry. The outdoor environments are a little bit more interesting, at least in towns where there are different buildings and stuff like that. But everything looks like it could have been created in Microsoft Paint. And, is that okay? Well, it really depends. It depends on what your overall definition of high quality graphics are. For the time, and for a Windows 3.1 title, and for a solo developed affair, I've got to say it's okay. I mean, the visuals are not going to win any awards here. This is nothing like you would see in any sort of 16-bit RPGs that were released around the same time as the retail release of this game. It looks probably a little bit worse than most 8-bit titles from the NES that I've played. And, oh, by the way, animations, there's almost no animations in the game because when you move around the screen or your opponents move around the screen, it's literally just a tile-to-tile copy kind of thing. So if you press up, it'll just move your icon for your character up to the next tile. There's no animated walk sequence or anything like that. There are some animations in the game, especially around some of the breath attacks that the dragons have, where if a white dragon attacks you with their breath attack, you will see a cloud of icy smoke or icy breath, I guess is the best way to put it, just expand around you. So there are some animations, but there really aren't that many to speak of. And combat is literally just seeing the 2 icons standing next to each other. The thing is that everything about the visual environment screams old. And you might think that this would be a serious impediment to enjoying the game. But honestly, that's not the case at all. Sure, Castle of the Winds is obviously an older game, and the graphics are obviously more rudimentary than what you'd see in any game today, and even more rudimentary than many games released in the later 80s and early 90s. But honestly, it doesn't really matter. I'd mentioned that your overall love of the graphics is going to depend on your overall desire to see less than high quality or less than high definition graphics. For me, and I think you all know, I love playing these older titles. For me, I think that there's actually a surprising amount of charm that's included here that can't be neglected. I can't help but love the paper doll cutout of your character on the equipment screen, which literally looks like it was drawn freehand in Microsoft Paint. And I use the term literally, because it really does look like something from Microsoft Paint. But I also can't help but love the different equipment icons that, while limited, are distinct enough to let you know what kind of armor or weaponry you're about to pick up. I can't help but love the creature design, which, while simple and having nearly no animations whatsoever, are all diverse enough to make it feel like you're exploring a veritable menagerie of foes. And let me tell you, the creature design is surprisingly effective. I can guarantee that if you play the game for any length of time and you encounter a wandering manticore or carrion crawler in the deeper levels of a dungeon while you're low on hit points, the fear and awe that will end up gripping you is as palpable as if you just encountered a 4K rendered dragon on a modern console or computer. The bottom line is that the graphics are very simple, but they are still well done. In fact, I would argue that the graphics here are actually more effective at allowing your imagination to run wild than if the game were higher detailed, because your brain can fill in the gaps of whatever monstrosity you're attacking, making the icon-based artwork included with the game a much more menacing visual in your mind's eye. Like I said, if you are a stickler for higher fidelity graphics, you may be put off a bit when you start playing the game. But trust me, stick with it, and I can assure you that the graphics will grow on you just a little bit, and even further, may become something that you end up truly appreciating simply for their charm. Moving on to the sound and music, well, this discussion is a little bit easier than the graphics because the simple fact is there is no music or sound in the game. Like I mentioned when we were looking at the back of the box, nothing is here. Not even a sound effect or a minor sound sample, other than the Windows 3.1 chime that automatically plays whenever you mess up navigating the overall menu system of the game. Otherwise, the auditory environment here is non-existent. And surprisingly, I'm actually okay with that. I know this might sound odd because most of you probably recognize that I love video game music, and in literally every game we cover, I talk at length about the sound and music included with the experience, so you might assume that I would be upset about the lack of sound and music here. The interesting thing, though, is that the lack of music and audio in Castle of the Winds actually makes it easier to get into a sort of flow state with the game, where you're simply exploring your environment, fighting off foes, picking up loot, finding secret doors, and progressing to whatever battle awaits you next. If the game featured a ton of music and sound effects, it's entirely possible that I would have been taken out of the experience a bit, instead of experiencing the level of hard-to-explain immersion that I ended up feeling while playing the game. It's an odd thing to be sure, but for some reason, the lack of music and sound effects in Castle of the Winds feels like something that helps immerse you more in the game, a feeling I did not expect, but also one that I can't deny. In this case, no audio equals no problem. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as a nameless, until you name them, protagonist who has a mysterious family lineage that's unknown to you, having been raised by your godparents. You've lived a simple life on your family's farm, content with tilling the fields and raising various animals and livestock. And though your life has been uneventful, you are, at your core, happy. As is often the case, happiness can be fleeting, as one day a roving band of bandits and mercenaries attack your family's farm, burning it to the ground and killing your godparents. Luckily, you weren't at the farm when those bandits attacked, so you end up surviving the assault. Unluckily, it turns out the reason they attacked the farm in the first place was to find and kill you. Filled with a desire for revenge as well as uncertainty about why you're being targeted, you set off on a quest to avenge your family's death and learn more about your lineage. Along the way, you'll encounter a ton of different creatures and monsters, explore the depths of 3 different dungeons, and equip yourself to face the onslaught of enemy minions. Will you be successful in your quest? There's only one way to find out. I've got to say, I really enjoyed the story here, which was told via occasional in-game pop-up windows to explain what was going on and the situations you find yourself in. Sometimes you find a note that provides additional story exposition, while other times encountering a certain creature might display a text-based cutscene of sorts that sets up the battle you're about to undertake. In all instances, the story is intriguing, and while I'd argue that the story is not the star of the show here, there's definitely an interesting narrative to experience, and there's just enough here to make it worth your time to play the game. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we've already talked extensively about the game, its framework, and the underlying controls for the title, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I will say, though, is that Castle of the Winds, despite using a ton of keyboard commands and shortcuts that at a glance might feel complicated, is actually a pretty streamlined affair, and it won't take you long to acclimate to the decidedly older school style of controls that the game employs. If you've played other old school titles and been put off by the number of keyboard commands and shortcuts that you might have to memorize, you may be hesitant to give Castle of the Winds a go, but trust me. Give it maybe 30-ish minutes, and I can almost guarantee the controls will feel like second nature. And even beyond that, I'd wager that the simple yet addictive gameplay will begin to grip you, making you want to play the game more. And actually, we should probably talk about this addictive quality a bit more, because I often see gamers in different online forums suggest that they just can't play retro titles because the graphics are too rudimentary, or the gameplay is too simple, or any other number of potential complaints. The argument is often that these older games are just not worth your time today, and that you couldn't possibly enjoy an older game the same way you would a modern title, especially considering how polished most modern games are. Those arguments further contend that the people who reminisce about older titles only have nostalgia for those games because they didn't have exposure to the games of today, and if they did have the opportunity to play modern games back when they were younger, then they would have never claimed that these older titles were worth their time. To all of that, I simply say, no. Just no. Not to get on a soapbox, but there's a reason why certain games are so highly regarded, even today, and it's not because we're viewing these games through rose-colored glasses. Most of the time. No, oftentimes, the reason the classics of yesteryear are still talked about today is because they have a core gameplay framework that's simply fun. And that core gameplay loop makes it so that you don't need the best graphics or the best audio or the most complex controls to truly love the game you're playing. If the gameplay is up to snuff, then the rest of the game's features become an enhancement rather than the reason for playing. And that is exactly the case with Castle of the Winds. It's not the prettiest game, and it has no audio at all, and the general narrative structure is exceedingly simple. But regardless, it is still an addictive experience that will capture your attention, The only thing you have to do is give it some time and look past the decidedly older styled visuals and gameplay that turn some people off to retro titles. If you let yourself simply play the game, I can assure you, you will learn pretty quickly that there's a lot to like here. So, what is our verdict on Castle of the Winds? Well, Castle of the Winds surprised me, because at a glance, you might think that this is a primitive, simple affair that couldn't possibly hold up today. But then you begin playing the game, and you realize that there's a level of depth below the surface that makes for a strangely compelling, if not downright addictive experience, and one that makes you want to explore just one more dungeon level before calling it quits for the night, very similar to the kind of addictive qualities that modern action role-playing games and other roguelike experiences instill in their players today. Castle of the Winds demonstrated these addictive qualities too, all the way back in the late 80s, and in many ways, Castle of the Winds was Diablo before Diablo was Diablo. I know there's a contingent of fans that already realize this, but for others, it bears repeating. Castle of the Winds did action RPG styled gameplay before the action RPG was even really a thing. Castle of the Winds is a lesser talked about, though still incredibly important release in computer gaming, and I for one am saddened that the game isn't more widely known than it is, because what's here is pretty darn special. It's so special, in fact, that I can unequivocally declare that Castle of the Winds is 100% deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. This is an early example of an addictive roguelike action RPG, and it is an experience that I can wholeheartedly recommend to everyone to play. Even if you take a look at the screenshots and think there is no way I will like this game, I implore you, give it a chance. It won't take long for Castle of the Winds to win you over, much as it did me, which is why Castle of the Winds has just become the newest inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time for this week's set of gaming challenges, and they are all, of course, focused on Castle of the Winds. Your first challenge, worth a single coin, is to reach level 2 of the mines. The mines are the very first dungeon of the game. If you can reach the second floor, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge, worth 2 coins, is to arrive at your second town. After you beat the mines, you will be whisked off to a new village. If you can reach that new town, you will earn 2 coins. And finally, your third challenge, worth 3 coins, is to make your way to level 5 of the fortress. This is the second dungeon included in the game, so all of these challenges can be completed in Castle of the Winds 1. If you can reach level 5 of the fortress, the second dungeon in that part of the game, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Castle of the Winds. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Ninja Gaiden Black, so definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Ninja Gaiden Black. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.